Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I'm your host and producer. My name is James Pagashnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, most notably from theathletic.com. He is Mr. Useful Human, Arif Hassan. Arif, has anyone sent you in their board for next year's draft?
Not quite yet. I'm sure as soon as Dane publishes his way too early mock draft, which I think is going to be up by the time most people listen to this, I'm going to receive a board or two. And I want to be clear, I don't want it. It's if I put it in, you're gonna update the board. I'm gonna change it. That's work for me. That's work you're doing anyway. I am done with work. I've ended work. So please don't. No one's happy.
Like, no, listen, I'm done killing. I got out. Did you see how many people I killed with a spreadsheet? It was John Wick style. I'm done. I want out. The Russians said I was good. That is going to be it for the John Wick portion of today's podcast. Welcome to Norse Code. The draft is over. The draft has just begun. We have plenty of stuff to talk about. We have a number of Vikings players to talk about. Well, now Vikings players who have been drafted. We have some undrafted free agents that we know a little bit about, but should be interesting to see what happens to them going further down the line. And of course, the mailbag. But before we do any of that, just want to thank you guys so much for listening to Norse Code. Hope you guys enjoyed last episode, the not only the return of Luke Inman, which I thought was fantastic, and I thought that it was the reunion that people didn't know they needed, especially the opening with Jerry. I just wanted to let you guys know I enjoyed that a lot.
Good feelings all around. I'm glad we were able to bring Luke on.
Yeah, that was fantastic. And of course, Arif and I were actually able to do that episode live in person, which is a rarity. I happened to be in town. So that was really cool. Glad you guys enjoyed that. Let's go into the shilling portion of today's program. If you enjoy the show and would like to help financially support Norse Code, you can do so in a couple of different ways. The best way you can do it is over at Patreon, patreon.com/Norse Code. For $3.50 a month, that gets you access to bonus material, that gets you access to things like the Discord, where we individually will post on, along with Mr. Crispy, Dusty O'Connell. And you can check all of that out. We got other bonus stuff that'll be posted over at Patreon as well. So $3.50 a month, patreon.com/Norse Code. And this week, we'd like to thank Jeremy Barnum, specifically, for donating to the cause. Thank you so much. It allows us to be ad-free. It allows us to do things like live show, travel, get new equipment when things break, stuff like that. So thank you so much, Jeremy. If you'd like, you can also go to paypal.me/Norse Code, or you can go to norsecode.threadless.com and get yourself the Arif throw pillow, which is just a fantastic piece of work. We didn't reveal a new thing this week. I didn't go up on Threadless and put a new item on.
You didn't threaten me with products?
Well, one week it was the throw pillow. Then we did the shower curtain, which is just haunting. No one has bought a shower curtain as far as I know yet. But
yeah, we've had a couple of people tell us they've been close, but that their significant others have decided absolutely not.
Which fair.
Which, by the way, I'm on their side. I just want this to be like, you cannot appeal to me to buy the shower curtain. Like if I am not opposed to having, but you could just PayPal me money. Like I don't need you to buy the shower curtain.
Like you could save yourself some dignity by sending Arif $7 directly.
All right, which is, by the way, cheaper than the shower curtain, but probably also the amount of money we make off the shower. So you could just send me $7. I can tell you, hey, I hope you like your shower curtain, with the understanding that one will never arrive. We've just made a social agreement to believe it exists.
It's kind of like Avril. It's kind of like Avril doing tours now.
Right.
Jeez. But yes, norsecode.threadless.com, where you can get your Arif pillow. So all the shilling is completed. Let's get into the draft episode. So the Vikings were going to select at 12 and then traded with the Lions. And there are some who believe that the trade was one-sided toward the Lions. There are some who believe that the trade was one-sided to the Vikings. Others say, why the hell are you trading within the division?
So I'll answer that last bit first. I don't see a huge problem with trading in the division. It's just your margin for error on that sort of thing is much smaller because the impact is much larger, obviously. The thing about like the way people treat it is that like, hey, you're giving them an asset, but if you win the trade, you're taking more assets away from a division rival than you're giving them. So they'll have acquired something that they want, sure, but if what they want and how they win are two different things, you want that to happen. You want them to want as many of those things as possible. And so if you're winning these trades, that's fantastic news. Because it is essentially, let's say it's double impact. It's probably actually a little bit more, but you have a big impact on your division rivals' outcomes. And if you're right, then you have done something that has, off the field, right, accelerated your ability to beat them in the long run, which is a good thing, right? So that's my take on divisional trades. But that's it. You have to be right. And with the Lions one, it ends up being kind of complicated. And the reason for that is if you take a look at the way NFL trades over the past couple of years, or even this year, we can even just compare it to trades this year, that have been conducted, you can use something called the Rich Hill trade chart. Rich Hill is a blogger for Pat's Pulpit. He does really excellent work. Generally, we've had him on the show before on the very few occasions the Vikings have had to play the Patriots. Or I don't know if we've had him on the show, but he's the first person I contact, and he always tells me who to grab instead. So I guess maybe he doesn't want to be on the show, in which case he's not very good at writing. Don't read his stuff. But over at Patriots Pulpit, he produces a board every year that quantifies all of the pick-for-pick trades that occur within the same year to figure out what the true trade value is. And he did this a couple of years ago when we found out, and we kind of knew because no teams were matching the Jimmy Johnson trade chart, but he found out essentially what those values actually were and what teams in the contemporary NFL environment were trading for. And so that tells you what the market is. That is entirely separate from whether or not trades help you more than hurt you, but it is not completely independent either. So we know the market price of picks, generally speaking. You can't get a great price because your currency is other draft picks. They are not very liquid. You can't have fractional draft picks, right? It's not like you have pennies where you can just stack up enough pennies and get as close to the true value as possible. You can only approximate it. But from the market perspective, the Vikings lost the trade with the Lions, right? So they give up pick number 12, which is 347 points. And, the points are arbitrary values, right? But 347 points and pick number 46, which is 128 points. They got back picks number 32, 34, and number 66. And so the way a lot of people were characterizing, and I don't think that this is an incorrect way to characterize it. I actually think this is a better way to characterize it because it really helps you envision it, is that the Vikings traded down 20 spots in the first round to trade up 12 spots in the second round, and for their trouble, received a third-round pick. And so in your head, you're trying to figure out, okay, is trading down 20 spots in the first round, up 12 spots in the second round, is that deficit worth a third-round pick, essentially? And most people's answer to that is no. And the market's answer to that is no. So the Vikings ended up giving up 475 points of value and receiving 435. So that's minus 9.2% in market value. Now, there are two other trades that we can kind of compare this to. Nothing quite as dramatic as a drop from 12 to 32. There's a trade 2 spots down and a trade 5 spots down right near where the Vikings were picking at 12. So Washington gives up pick number 11, which is 358 points, for the Saints picks number 16, 98, and 120, which are respectively 305, 38, and 26 points, for a total of 369 points. Nice. Which means that Washington earned a positive 3% on their trade value. So the Vikings lost 9.2%. Washington gained 3.0% on their trade down. The Texans, when they traded down with the Eagles, traded down just 2 spots. So 336 points from pick number 13 to pick number 15 for 315 points, earning a bunch of late round picks or mid to late round picks afterwards. So picks 124, 162, 166, which is 24, 10, and 9 points respectively. That's a total of 358 points. That is a gain for the Texans of 6.5%. So they acquired more capital than they lost. So the Vikings were -9. These two were between 3 and 6%. Let's say it's 4.5%. So the difference in what the Vikings were able to do with their market and what these two teams were able to do with their market is about a 16% difference, which that's bad. that's bad. The thing is, if this is the only offer, the Vikings actually 16 is a 14% difference. If this was the Vikings' only offer, they still should have made the trade according to kind of the analytics derived charts. And there's a couple of them. You can use the Chase Stewart chart, which was the one derived off of historical approximate value. An approximate value is a measure created by the people who originally created Pro Football Focus, Doug Drynen, and I think Jason Lisk was part of that effort. And Chase Stewart was actually part of that effort as well, to attempt to put a number on essentially a player's career. And it's really remarkable, incredible work. It is also work that was done in like the 90s and 2000s, and so it's not as precise as it could be. But that chart was our first ability to kind of use historical data about player outcomes, at least on the media and fan side, to determine, what picks are actually worth versus what picks are historically worth. And so by that chart, the Vikings won the trades. They earned more wins above replacement. Now, PFF has a more contemporary chart that is based off of PFF wins above replacement. It's much more granular. And whereas approximate value is position blind, essentially, you can, for example, have more approximate value as a guard than somebody who's a quarterback that just matters much more than that guard. That's just, so it's position blind. And so it only accounts for positional value by the way the NFL does, by pushing those positions down in the actual draft. Now, PFF is not. They calculate literally the wins above replacement that player generally does using their own internal grading system, and of course the wins above replacement formula that Timo Risk and Eric Eager and a number of the other data analysts at PFF have come up with. And they also determined that the Vikings won the trade by an analytic standpoint. Brad Spielberger over the Cap, and also with PFF, built a chart based off of contract values, second contracts for players. What is the second contract worth for players? Because that's essentially in an uncapped relative to rookie contracts environment. It's obviously capped in the NFL environment, which also makes it convenient too, because you can turn it into percentages. And they also found that based off of player outcomes, that the Vikings won the trade. So from a market perspective, the Vikings lost the trade. From a wins above replacement or analytics perspective, the Vikings won the trade. The reason I think this trade is bad is not because the Vikings did not find a way to add value. It's that they gave up an opportunity cost here. There is very likely another trade that they could have made here that would have generated much more value for them. Even if they had traded down a couple of spots, let's say for the Eagles, right, to 15 from 12, they could have traded down again with, like, let's say the Bills, right, who had to trade up for who they wanted, or any number of other teams. There were a bunch of trades. There were a bunch of trade opportunities. And so if they traded down, grabbed picks, 124, 162, 166, and pick number 15, and then another pick on top of that, that would have been great. And then they could have traded down again and then packaged some of those picks together to move up in the second round and all that. So they had an opportunity cost with the market that they had available to them, and they lost according to the market, and they happened to gain by wins above replacement. Now, I've seen a number of people kind of put together what the Vikings gained from it by by identifying all the players eventually involved in the trades, right? So Lewis Cine picked number 32, and then pick number 34 was traded down, and so you get, I think was it Krauser ended up having like the whole thing. You ended up trading down with pick number 34 to 36, and so whatever the result of that trade was, you end up with Andrew Booth, and so on and so forth. So you get Scene, you get you traded back down to where you were essentially, so you were going to get Booth either way, but then you end up with like Ed Ingram, and Brian Asamoah, and Evans and Odomewo and Chandler, and so they say that kind of overwhelms the difference between, say, Hamilton, who you could have picked at 12, versus Scene, and so I actually don't think that that's a very compelling argument, right? So if you have Hamilton and you draft who was drafted there, maybe Zach Tom, Andrew Booth, and Jackson, versus Scene, Booth, Ingram, Asamoah, Evans, Odomewo, and Chandler, I don't know, especially because you'd probably continue moving around in the draft and finding new ways to create opportunities. But the thing is not the only two universes you have available to you. You had other trade down universes available to you. And so that's why I didn't really like the trade. The other way around, the Packers trade, I think everyone kind of agrees that the Vikings, from a trade value perspective, won it, right? Like, I think that, that's what you've seen, right? Is that most people are talking about the Vikings like they won that Packers trade.
Well, yeah, the idea being that the Vikings had a very early second-round pick, and the Packers threw 2 second-rounders in order to enable to move up, with the idea they probably could have traded with just about anybody else to get up there. So, yeah, the idea is that the Packers got fleeced on that almost as much as the Vikings, quote-unquote, got fleeced on the Lions trade.
Yeah, and when the market kind of agrees, and I didn't do the math on this, but when the market kind of agrees that the team that traded down won, then almost 100% of the time, the data analysts using their outcome-oriented pick calculators, whether that has to do with approximate value, PFF or contract data, which I think all three of those perspectives are actually really valuable to have for different reasons. Then you really have a good case that you super won the trade. So the Vikings traded pick number 34 for picks number 53 and 59. And then, of course, they traded 53 again because, it wouldn't be a Vikings draft. They didn't just keep on trading picks that they acquired. This time to the Colts, who used it to select Alec Pierce. This allowed the Vikings to go up to 46, which was their original pick. No, not 46. 42, so a little bit above their original pick, and select Andrew Booth, along with, a third-round pick and a sixth-round pick, I think. And that's why I don't like saying these are the two classes against each other, because like the third round pick that you traded to get it back up to 42, like who knows what happens in that scenario, and so on and so forth. So it's like difficult to compare the classes directly, but that was probably good, especially because we know that, Christian Watson, an NDSU alum, is not going to be good at football. Like, I just name one NDSU alum who's good at football. You can't. So,
I mean,
what? Name one.
I'm not. I mean, Trey Lance had his moments, but
the best one I can think is actually on the Vikings, Ben Ellefson. That's it. Billy Turner's had his time. Trey Lance is, acclimated position of quarterback. He's acclimating so well that the 49ers have not given up on Jimmy Garoppolo. So
yeah, as per the fellow who keeps drawing him every day until he's traded. Well, let's get into some picks here, because sure. we've got plenty of people to talk about, including round 1, 32nd overall, Lewis Cine, safety out of Georgia. Yeah.
I like the player a lot, and my first reaction to the pick itself was that I liked Lewis Cine. I thought that maybe they'd grab a falling player. Cine is I think number 33 on the consensus big board. In fact, I might as well just pull it up right now so I don't embarrass myself like looking into all of this. But number 33 in the consensus big board, but we did have like a number of followers, and I thought that if they had grabbed someone who's like falling down the board, and mind you, if they had grabbed Andrew Booth there, I would not have had the knowledge that Andrew Booth would have fallen further, right? And so I would have assumed, right, that Andrew Booth was a steal. Like, good job that you got him at 32. Good job not pulling the trigger there. So yeah, you got Lewis Cine, but you know, they could have drafted Malik Willis and made things really exciting. They could have drafted Nakobe Dean. Again, these are guys that fell like to the 80s, right? They could have drafted David Ajabo and just said, hey, we're going to wait on this first round pick. I think some people would have been kind of interested in that. They could have traded up from 32 and grabbed somebody. I think actually, if they had drafted the guy who went, he's like right after him on the big board, Arnold Ebiketie, the guy who went number 38. That would have been fun too. But I think Lewis Cine, he wasn't a steal. He's perfectly valued there. But I personally like, aside from whatever the consensus ranking is, I personally like him as a player. Luke's been tweeting out some videos of Lewis Cine, which are mostly representative of his ability, that I think are pretty exciting. Yeah, I mean, he's a remarkably fast guy. The difference between him and Hamilton in terms of the way that you evaluate them in terms of like speed and size and physicality is that Cine at least tested to his playing speed, right? He ran a 4.37 or something along those lines, and he had a phenomenal combine. Overwhelmed by some of the other safeties in the combine just in terms of their testing, but he had a really great combine, and he's had really good production. He actually led the Georgia defense in tackles, and very often you'd be kind of concerned, like, if a defensive back is leading your team in tackles, what does that say about your pass coverage? I don't think anyone has that concern when it comes to Georgia, right? Like, no one is like, yeah, that Georgia defense, it was leaky as hell. Lewis Cine grabbed a bunch of tackles by just allowing catches and coverage. No, he was a really good run defender. And he's really great at determining blocking angles and getting to the runner and generating tackles for loss or tackles near the line of scrimmage. Let me pull up his like PFF grades real quick because I thought they were pretty impressive. But the things that kind of stand out is that there are some very similar things between Lewis Cine and Kyle Hamilton. Now, Hamilton's 220 pounds, right? Like he's like 6'2". He's like a different size of human and would play a different role. But in terms of how hard they hit, the range that they demonstrate, you get a sense, right, that they can occupy similar roles in the defense. So his coverage grade and his run defense grade are virtually identical in the PFF system. He has very low missed tackle rate among safeties near the top. He had a fairly high stop rate in coverage. And his coverage capability, he gave up like one touchdown all year, according to PFF. He had one interception and 7 pass breakups. His coverage capability was kind of up there, and he was meant to be kind of the safety valve, I guess, of the defense. While the rest of the defense was making big plays, he was covering up mistakes, was kind of the role that he had, like truly embodying the name safety. And so he ended up playing a variety of coverages in order to kind of embrace that role, whether it was, occasionally single, high, deep, but a lot of cover 2, a lot of cover 4 stuff. The Kirby Smart defense and the Nick Saban, well, I guess it's not the Kirby Smart defense, but a lot of the elements of the Nick Saban defense that people have become very familiar with evaluating are there in what George is asking, safeties like Lewis Cine to do. And so, and I guess he prefers to be called Lou, but that I thought was a really great pick. And I think that you can have him play a versatile role, even though he played kind of closer to the box a lot of the time at Georgia. I don't know. There's not like a bunch of bad things I want to say about him. He wasn't a huge playmaker, I guess, is maybe part of it. He wasn't kind of central to a lot of big plays. And so if you're looking for a safety that's going to kind of generate a lot for you, this is probably not the guy. But in terms of doing all of the kind of preventing big play stuff that you ask of a safety, he's got it. Now, I think one thing that kind of comes up is whether or not he can play man coverage. And that's going to come up because the Vikings don't have a ton of cornerback depth in like the slot, right? Like it's Chandon Sullivan and then Perry Nickerson. It kind of depends on whether or not you think Harrison Hand is a slot guy. I don't think he lined up there all that often in training camp, but that is a possibility. And then there's one other player, like an undrafted free agent that could play in the slot. So they don't have really great slot play. So if they put three safeties on the field, can Lewis Cine play man coverage over the slot? And I would argue no. I don't think that he's a great man coverage player. There are some clips that suggest that he could be. I know that Cameron Bynum, people thought that maybe he could play man coverage, but if he could, he'd probably be a corner, right? Instead of a safety. I don't know that you have that answer. Certainly he has the athletic capability to do man coverage stuff. But that is currently an area where I'd be uncomfortable. And that's fine. Harrison Smith is not very good at man coverage either. He's actually a phenomenal safety anyway. So that doesn't bother me. But that is something to kind of keep in mind, is that in terms of the versatility you get out of him, you're getting a lot of versatility, but you're not getting Harrison Smith, who can also do pass rushing stuff, or Derwin James, who can also do man coverage stuff. You're getting a classically diverse safety. So, but I really like his range, and I like his ability to kind of erase, deep throws, especially for quarterbacks that don't have a ton of arm strength and can't kind of fit the ball into tight windows.
What do you think about his tackling?
It's fun to watch, that's for sure. He hits really hard. And that's, I think, what might remind a lot of people of Harrison Smith. The thing is, unlike someone like Andrew Sandeo, from what I can tell based off of the data and what I've looked at, there aren't a lot of misses, right? It's not as if he is failing to like wrap up and creating like opportunities for opponents, right? Because, you saw Andrew Sandeo just kind of lay his shoulder down, and if he misses, not only has he dislocated his shoulder, the guy is still up, and somewhere, one of your teammates is now out with a concussion, right? Like that's like one of the things that you're always worried about. That like he could probably get better at tackling, but he didn't miss a lot of tackles, and I feel like he understands, the need to wrap up and the need to kind of aim where he needs to aim in order to bring the ball carrier down. So I think that he's largely a good tackler. There is kind of more to discover there, and become a better tackler. But I think for the most part, he does a good job finding ways to bring ball carriers down. And so even though he's about 200 pounds, his combine was 199, his pro day was 202. Even though he's about 200 pounds, I think that he'll generally do fine bringing down 220-pound ball carriers. Now, if he's up against like Derrick Henry, I've probably given that one to Henry. But for the most part, I think that his tackling is violent and fun and generally pretty safe.
Well, let's go to round 2, 42nd overall. We have Andrew Booth Jr., cornerback from Clemson.
Yeah, he's somebody that the Vikings did not have athletic testing for. I asked, hey, when you don't have that, obviously a big component of the way that you want to combine every source of information that you have together is workout data. You don't have that. He had a strained quad, and so he didn't work out at the combine or the pro day. What's interesting is that at the combine, he measured in at 6 feet tall and 2/8 of an inch with a 76 and 7/8 inch wingspan. At the pro day, he measured in 3/8 of an inch shorter at 5'11 and 7/8 of an inch with a 78 and a quarter inch wingspan, which is 1 3/8 of an inch longer. And like, I don't know how that happens. Like, because if his arm length changed, which it did technically change from 31.5 to 31.8, that would make sense because there's some inconsistency with the way the NFL measures arm length. Are they starting from like the point of the shoulder? Are they starting from just beyond it? Are they starting from the armpit? That can change because of the way the NFL measures. But like wingspan, you're just stretching out your hands and measuring finger to finger. Like there's not a ton of room for measurement error there. And then like his height just changed, which I wouldn't bring that up at all, except if you go through all of the different combine and pro day heights and weights, like they don't really change for most players at all. They almost hit them, even the weights, they almost hit them exactly. So that one's kind of funny. Anyway, I asked about like how they could do that, and they do talk about like using GPS data a little bit, kind of constructing based off of film, and backwards analytics, I guess, or machine learning, how to determine one's 10 split and 40 time, and kind of guessing at what a player's overall athletic profile is, and then projecting that onto that analytic score. Now, Kwesi did mention that is not a super refined process, and he gives you a lot of room for error, but it does kind of give you peace of mind over the kind of person that he can be. Anyway, the issue with Booth is that, so he's a very good player. And in fact, in the very first mock draft that Dane Brugler did, Andrew Booth actually became a Viking at, maybe it was at 12. Maybe it was at the end of the season he did his first mock draft. But he was a Viking somewhat early in the first round. And since then, he kept on falling down Dane Brugler's boards. And I learned that a big part of that was because of how much of a concern his injury history was. So he missed a game as a junior because of a hamstring injury in October of 2021, another game as a junior because of a stinger in November of 2021. When he was a freshman, he required surgery to repair a tear in his patella tendon in his right knee. That was January of 2020. He had knee tendonitis in high school, and he missed the pre-draft process because of grade 2 quad strain injury, as well as a double hernia surgery. So he had a hernia surgery, I believe, at the conclusion of Clemson's season, and then he had another to clean things up, either early April or late March. I don't quite know the timeline here, but it's essentially the week that composes late March, early April, and that one is fine. The thing is, a lot that sounds really bad, and it is genuinely something to be concerned about. But from my understanding of his high school quote unquote injuries, is that a lot of it has to do with the way that he grew, like as a kid. Like he just grew up so fast that the bones in his knees were outgrowing his tendons. And so it was an extreme case of growing pains. And tendonitis is typically associated with conditions that are chronic and long-term, and this is not that. That's my understanding. I'm not a doctor, right? So I could be wrong in the way that I'm describing some of these things, but it was communicated to me that that's actually not really an issue to be concerned about going forward. And obviously the patellar tendon tear that could in theory have kind of a long-term problem here. And then also the hernia surgery, having 2 surgeries, again, kind of a problem, but it's the most common surgery in sports. And you can play without it. Without the surgery, you just have to play through an enormous amount of pain. And the cleanup surgery is also very common. And so when, I don't know if it was Ed Donatello, no, it was Ryan Grigson. Grigson said, like, yeah, this surgery is really common. Everybody who's ever had it has come out positive, which is just like a weird thing to say about a surgery. Like, I bet that that's not true. But, he's like, yeah, everybody who's ever had this surgery has had a successful surgery. We know, like, famously, Christian Darrisaw did not. Like last year, but if Booth is ready to play, he's ready to play. The thing is, in his interview with the media, he said the phrase, "This will be the first time I'll have played football while healthy since middle school or something like that, maybe early high school." So he was saying that he was never healthy when he played in high school or in college. Which
concerning.
He is trying to
concerning.
Yeah, it's very concerning. He is trying to communicate, I you know how well I played? I'm going to play even better because I'm finally healthy. But what we're hearing is, dude, you're hurt all the time? That's what you're saying?
You're like, oh, you're a corner who's going to get hurt every game? Oh, well, we actually have...
What's that like?
Yeah, we have actually been thinking that it was time to bring back Xavier Rhodes. So yeah, okay, we're good.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, Booth is really fun to watch. When he's on the field, he's got remarkable ball tracking skills with the balls in the air. He's great, I think, at contested catches. He led his team in interceptions despite missing a couple of games due to injury. I think he would have led his team in pass deflections. He has not just great instincts and a good, I would say, feel for the game. He also just has really smooth athletic capability and a lot of speed as well. So there's a lot there. He does need to improve particularly probably in zone coverage, his ability to diagnose correctly And when he is in zone coverage, there's a lot of like catch and tackle. Like if you're defending a curl route, you're allowing them essentially 5 yards, so you need to be able to make that tackle. So sometimes he doesn't do that. But yeah, for the most part, it's mostly an injury concern with him. He's a really good player. I'm going to be concerned about whether or not he'll be healthy until he puts together like 2.5 seasons of health. And then halfway through the third season, I'll be like, okay, he's probably fine. But until then, until we get 2 full seasons and then I get halfway through a third season, I'm probably going to continue to be concerned about the medicals on this person. But he has experience in man and zone. He has experience in a system that maps pretty well onto NFL defenses. He has done a variety of man coverage types. He's done press. He's done off. He's done trail. He's done bail. It's really like he's a really excellent prospect in a lot of ways. I wouldn't say that if he was fully healthy, he'd be like Ahmad Gardner or Derek Stingley or anything like that. But I think that he would be much more comfortably in the conversation for number 3, ahead of McDuffie for most people, were it not for that health. So I think he is a pretty spectacular prospect, but the health thing is very concerning.
Do you think he competes for this year?
I think so. It sounds like he is like healthy. We'll see at OTAs or Vikings minicamp if they're letting him do stuff, because he is like coming off of surgery. But yeah, I think that he basically starts opposite Patrick Peterson. Like I think that is, you don't want to write it in. He has to like earn it, right? But like, yeah, I think that the idea that the Vikings have right now is that this guy is their day 1 starter at corner.
All right, so the third pick that they had was round 2, 59 overall, Ed Ingram, offensive line from Louisiana State. We're going to save that one for last because that one is going to take up the bulk of our time. Let's go to the next pick, which was 66 overall, round 3, Brian Asamoah. That was a linebacker from Oklahoma.
Yeah, this one's interesting. He's somewhat light for a linebacker, but very athletic. I thought that his testing scores when I ran them through my machine stood out. I really wish he would have done the agility drills because I would have had a full score for him. But he kind of embodies a lot of what we'd been seeing from the Fangio, Staley style defenses for what those linebackers end up looking like. They tend to be, you don't tend to invest them in the first or even second round. They tend to go through fifth or even undrafted. But they tend to be lighter. They tend to be chase linebackers that they've got really good speed. They've got good sideline to sideline ability. And you're relying on that defensive line to keep them clean, to block up those people up front so that the guards can't get to the second level. And so that you can do all the stuff that lets you get these like really exciting tackles for loss, and so on and so forth. The problem is that, so like he is like kind of, I think Krauser on Twitter called him like a safety backer or something like that. And we've seen that mostly not succeed in the NFL, although it's gotten better over the years. We'll see how Isaiah Simmons does. I'm sure he'll be fun. We'll see how, if Shaq Thompson continues to excel, but more importantly, if Jeremy Chin does, because that I think is kind of a model for what that role is, right? But early on when people were like, yeah, Mark Barron is going to erase Jimmy Graham, like that was not working out for people. I guess Telvin Smith was fine, but actually Telvin Smith is not a bad jumping off point for this one. Ignoring kind of the off-field stuff and the retirement stuff. Telvin Smith was like a 218, 250-pound linebacker, which, by the way, so is Jeremiah Owusu-Koromoa, who was drafted by the Browns and the regime that Kwesi was in, who he compared Asamoah to directly. And Telvin Smith was a much better run defender than he was a coverage player, despite the fact that he seemed to have profiled as a coverage player, as a lighter linebacker. You'd expect him to kind of be a good coverage player. I'm kind of getting the same vibe from Asamoah. I'd like to watch him a little bit more to get a better understanding of that, but he does not feel like a particularly great coverage player to me. Based off of what I saw, based off of the way that he was handling a lot of this stuff, he's more upside in coverage, but he is much more of a run defending guy. So I'm a little bit concerned about who he is and how he plays. He is a little bit better at dealing with blocks than some of these lighter guys at linebacker. So that is nice to see that He can handle blocks pretty well. He's going to be an immediate contributor on special teams. That's going to be good. But yeah, he does a good job kind of sifting through the trash and finding like very, very classic, like Will linebacker stuff, like way back when people called, linebackers Will, Mike, and Sam and had like very specific rules for all of them. In the Vikings old system, the Will did have to take on blocks, but in most systems, the Will linebacker would take advantage of the fact that the middle linebacker and the Sam linebacker were taking on blocks. The Will linebacker would seek and destroy, essentially, would try to find the running back amidst all that garbage. And so that is kind of the skill set that he has, that he can do that. I don't know how well that translates at the next level. Honestly, I think that that is a continued concern. Like, I don't know that he can kind of always do that. And he can get a little bit lost, but he's interesting. I like his upside, but I just really feel like the way he comes off and the way that he plays are like two different things, and it could be easy to be kind of disappointed by him. Right now, I do think that he is probably better to have on the field than Blake Lynch and Chaz Surratt and Troy Dye. So like, you do have that going for you, that you've upgraded a backup linebacker, but I'm just going to continue to be kind of concerned about like his level of play and if he's ever going to be more than a backup.
All right, round 4, 118 overall. Caleb Evans, cornerback, Missouri.
So, first of all, the pronunciation guide that Dane Brugler gave us, a Caleb, I guess, Evans. Apparently, Kwesi would sit up late at night watching a Caleb Evans film. So, you've got that going for you. He's very enamored with the Caleb Evans. Evans has a lot of experience with a variety of systems. He played first at Tulsa, then he transferred to Missouri after he graduated. He earned his degree, and so he had a free transfer. He didn't have to sit a year, and his position coach had been hired at Missouri, and so he might as well head over to Missouri. And his defensive coordinator there, I think, is an NFL defensive coordinator, Wilkes or something like that. He'd been a defensive coordinator in the NFL, so like that stuff should kind of translate. When looking at him on film, it feels like he's a thinner guy. Like it's somewhat reminiscent of Cameron Dantzler. He weighed in at 197 pounds, which is great because Dantzler weighed in at like 181, and you could tell he was like putting on weight to do that. He's like typically 170 something. But Caleb Evans weighed at 197 pounds and he ran a 4.46, right? He ran a good time with added on weight or with whatever weight he actually was, which is great. And his testing is very good. He ran a 4.46. He had a great 1.54 second 10-yard dash, which we'll talk about 10-yard dashes in a second. A vertical jump of 36, which is fine. Broad jump of 10.9, which is pretty good. And then some really good agility scores, 4.09 seconds in the short shuttle, 7.07 seconds in the 3-cone. Really great to see that. He does not have very much ball production, but he does have a lot of turnovers. He led the team in forced fumbles, which is nice, but it was just 2 forced fumbles. He was able to get his hand on the ball in terms of pass deflections. He was not able to catch the ball for many interceptions, which I guess is also a criticism of Lewis Cine, but Lou did all this other stuff too. He has height, he has length, he's got speed, he's got experience in a variety of systems, he's got physicality. There's some element of maybe you can match him up against tight ends if he continues to get bigger. The Vikings said that they see him as an outside corner. And they said when they had the scouts talk to the Vikings, which by the way, which was really fantastic, the scouts were able to talk to the media about their guys of Evans. We see maybe creating opportunities, matchup settings, maybe covering some tight ends, doing some specialized stuff. I think primarily he's an outside guy, and then as we get him comfortable, see if he can handle some different roles for us. He's got really good eyes, really good feet. He's got time on task at it. He sees the game well. For a bigger guy, remember he's 6'2", he has the quickness and the burst to do some of the man-to-man stuff. And as I mentioned earlier, anytime you have a long-armed corner, it lends itself well to the kind of developing his press technique and being effective that way. I think the zone stuff does just come more natural to him because that's what he's done and what he's had success with. He got a ton of penalties. He drew 10 flags for the last 2 seasons. And he just didn't get many interceptions. And so the Viking staff said that that is a technique issue, that he has a lot more to learn in terms of technique. So it sounds like he's pretty raw, technically speaking, but they really like his instincts. They really like his athleticism. They like that maybe long term they can make him a matchup option, but they're not going to do that short term. They're just going to have him learn the role for right now. But yeah, they think that his ball skills are fine and that his lack of turnovers is more to do with some of the technique stuff of getting into the position to get a turnover. I don't know if I fully agree with that, but I understand the sentiment. I don't know. He's somebody that I'm going to dive into a little bit more, see if I can watch more of him to try and understand why Kwesi was so up in his own head about this guy late at night on the tablet in bed.
You know, it did take.
Words, but I didn't add anything.
Well, no, I was going to say those were like literally his words or summation of him. So yeah, it's a bit odd, but he got his guy, so hopefully he's super right about this. Let's go to round 5, 165 overall. Asezi Otomewo, edge, out of Minnesota.
He was an edge defender from Minnesota. I see him as an inside guy. He weighed 280 pounds at his pro day. His second pro day because he had to opt out of the Gophers pro day because of injury. And the Vikings also seem to see him as an inside guy, but that they'll have him on the edge sometimes. They'll have him on the inside sometimes. So the unfortunate thing about Otomewo is that in addition to having that injury, right, he also is a bit of an older prospect, not like crazy old or anything like that. Like there's some older ones, like Michael Clemens, for example, is an older edge rusher, but he's one of the oldest prospects among edge rushers in the draft. Like I think Jermaine Johnson is older than him by a couple of days. I believe Arnold Ebiketie is, but for the most part, you don't have. Oh, and of course Boyd Mafe. But for the most part, you don't have very many people who are 23 years old on draft day, right? So there's that, and you combine that fact with the fact that he is just undeveloped. He's not very technical. And so you've got a player who wins based off of his athletic advantage that 23-year-olds have over 19-year-olds at the position. And he doesn't have pro day data entered into the Brugler scouting report because it was a private pro day and it happened after I think Brugler published the Beast, but the numbers were really phenomenal. I thought his agility scores were average to above average. I thought his explosion scores were phenomenal for a guy who's 282 pounds. Like that's the thing. So he's 6'5", 282 pounds. He's got 34-inch arms. His pro day measurement was nearly 35 inches, but his combine was 34 and a half. Again, kind of sometimes you just get some weird. The arm lengths are very, very different. And to speak to that point earlier, the wingspans are almost identical, right? At the pro day and the combine, the wingspans are 1/8 of an inch apart, but the arm lengths are somewhat far apart in a larger percentage apart. So that just kind of speaks to how weird arm length can be. But he has a lot more that he needs to do in order to demonstrate that he can play from down to down to down. He plays pretty high. He's got a high pad level. He doesn't always know what he's doing with his hands. He's got length. He doesn't always know how to use it. He's kind of late, kind of sometimes seeing what's happening with the play relative to some edge rushers that went higher in the draft. The Vikings explained it by saying he'd been through a number of different position coaches, and so you can never truly hit a ceiling. And so they hope that with the Vikings, that under Mike Smith over the next couple of years, that having the one position coach is going to help him kind of hit his ceiling, which I think is tremendous. But also you have to keep in mind that he is an older prospect that still doesn't have that development. They like his quickness. I like his quickness. I think that he is like the prototype of like a modern 3-4 defensive end that plays on the inside a lot because he has that length and he's got that pass rush skill. But it's just in terms of in terms of like where he is as a player, there's probably a lot left. So I still don't think the Vikings have an answer for who plays as the third defensive lineman in 3-4 sets.
Well, let's go to the next one, and this ended up being a running back. Round 5, 169 overall. Ty Chandler, running back out of North Carolina. Nice.
Yeah. Ty Chandler, currently in the playoffs, right? NBA player Tyson Chandler? I don't know. Certainly he's not a Timberwolf. We know he'd not be in the playoffs. Yeah, I don't love the pick. I don't hate it. I don't love it. This is a pick that I think went off of consensus. I'm going to sort by position real quick on the consensus board so I can see which running backs were ranked higher than him on consensus. Yeah, he was a 181 ranked player on the consensus board. He goes 169. Nice overall. There were some players ahead of him on the consensus board that were just ranked higher and went later. So Tyler Badie from Missouri is an example of one of those players. And then Abram Smith is an example of one of those players. I don't think he even got drafted. But running backs were pushed late. They were pushed out of the first round and then pushed up into the second and third rounds. We actually saw a bunch of second, third, and I guess actually even fourth rounders go. And so this was probably a bit of a run that they thought they needed to get at. Now, mind you, a lot of teams made many worse picks at running back, at least if you're using the consensus board to help kind of guide your decision-making here. Tyrion Davis-Price for the 49ers at 93, for example, is a much more egregious one. Actually made my biggest steals and reaches. But watching him play, I didn't really see all, and I haven't watched a ton of him. I watched a little bit to kind of confirm what Dane Brugler was saying. I didn't see a ton out there that I necessarily loved out of him, especially if you're going to get a speed guy that's going to hit home runs. I'd like to see somebody who just has a little bit more in terms of being able to create. Because he's not a power runner. I mean, like he doesn't really kind of take over when he hits contact, and his balance is only like okay, and so I don't really see it for him. I think like you already have that in Kenny Wangu. I'd rather see a long-term replacement for Alexander Madison, somebody who is instinctive and feels out blocks and stuff like that. And honestly, maybe you weren't able to get that this draft. Like the guy that would be maybe a perfect fit went like 18 picks sooner to the Atlanta Falcons. Tyler Algier is like, he's not an explosive guy, but he gets what's blocked to you and he runs over some people sometimes. And so that's pretty fun. So maybe, and remember, if I remember correctly, Alexander Madison was drafted the year he became the second back. And so like, it could just be that the Vikings won't draft their backup guy until next year anyway, but it would have been nice. He's a faster guy. He did not test very well in terms of agility, not super poorly, but he didn't test very well in terms of agility or explosion. It was really just straight 40 time and his speed there. He comes out of a system where it's a little bit easier to produce in the RPO style system that North Carolina has. I mean, I guess he's a bit of a pass catcher, but I wouldn't say that he was, that good of a route runner anyway. You'd have to teach him that, just like you would have to teach Kenny Wangu. And so he, to me, is like a fine player that went a little bit too high, was ranked even, in my opinion, a little bit too high by the consensus board. But the Vikings liked him. They think that the 40 time matches his tape. They envision a particular role for him. And so, see what they do with that, especially because, that system is known and notable for producing some big games out of lesser known running backs.
Let's go to the next one. Round 6, 184 overall. Vidarian Lowe, offensive tackle out of Illinois.
Yeah, I thought Lowe was a surprise pick to me. I think I'd actually crossed him off the list of Vikings based off of his athletic testing. Again, there's going to be a discussion about the 10-yard split. That'll be interesting. But for the most part, his 20-yard was pretty poor, which tends to correlate somewhat well with what, the Rams and the Browns and the Broncos have done for their, or I shouldn't say Broncos, for their kind of outside zone or mid zone. We'll talk about that in a second too. System. And he very much felt more like a power blocker to me. I Don't think that he's great. Again, I haven't watched a ton of him. I could change my mind on this one. But he is kind of just reliant on the fact that he's got size, and that size allows him to swallow up defenders in the run game or to kind of absorb contact in the passing game. And he's got good length and he's got good size and he's got a good punch. He can use that, but he's an older player that is already not that great of an athlete. I just don't see a ton of upside for him. It's hard to find, good guys in the 6th round, so I don't want to bang on this one too much, but I didn't love it. I think the most interesting thing about this pick is that the Vikings actually said on the record out loud the difference between mid zone and wide zone. Now, the thing is, I had this explained to me off the record months ago, and they would not let me talk about it. But now that they have it on the record, fantastic. So here it is. So someone asked, like, how is this guy a fit for an outside zone running scheme? And the answer from the scout, that's a really good question. It has changed a little bit. I feel like last year we were more of a wide zone team. This year he kind of puts an emphasis on guys who can run laterally, get to the sideline, cut people off. Now we're more of a mid zone team where you want guys with that footwork, but you also want guys who can play with dent, as we call it, who can move guys off the ball and play downhill when we want to move the ball in the run game. So Vidarian fits into it because he's got long arms, he's got good enough feet to play in the zone scheme, but he's also a big-bodied guy who can create movement at the point of attack. Another thing we like about him is his position flexibility, etc. They talk about his position flexibility. And so they asked him about position flexibility, and they said that he's not too tall for an offensive tackle to play guard. He's 6'4", 6'5". A lot of those guys play guard anyway, but he still has the length to play tackle, is basically their argument. That he can deal with the quickness of players inside. I don't know about that, but the Vikings really like his demeanor and his makeup. They call him a married and mature family man, like multiple times. People talk about it, which is great. But as a player, I don't really see it. Again, 6th round pick. I can't get crazy upset or excited about it. But the most interesting thing about this pick is that they began to reveal some of the secrets about the way that they run zone.
Let's go to round 6, 199 overall. Jalen Naylor, wide receiver out of Michigan State. That Michigan State team was a lot of fun to watch for the most part last year.
Yeah, and I guess in games that Naylor played, they were undefeated. I mean, they were nearly undefeated anyway, but just put that in there, makes it sound better. No, that Michigan State team was a lot of fun. I kind of wish they had beaten Michigan because it just would have been more interesting, I think. They probably would have gotten their doors blown off even worse than Michigan did against Georgia, but still, it would have been more interesting. Naylor he's kind of like a very low rent Laviska Shenault from was it Colorado State that went to Jacksonville. His timed testing did not match, I think, what a lot of people might have expected given his background, right? Because he's got this great track background that Dane Brugler kind of elucidates a lot, like high school state champion in 100 meters, 200 meters. And that's fine, but he ended up running, let me look it up just to be, a 4.5, which is very surprising. And he ran it at 186 pounds, right? Like, it's not like he ran it at 190 or 200. He'd put on too much weight. He ran a 4.5, which is very weird. But his other testing was really good. He had a 38-inch vertical, a 10.8-inch broad jump, a 7.03 second 3-cone, which implies potentially a better 40-yard dash time. But he did not choose to rerun at the pro day. And so either it's because he put on some extra weight, he added 6 pounds, or he felt that was actually fairly representative of his ability. And remember, this was a year where everybody was putting together fast times at the NFL Combine. And so everybody was getting, and we talked about that after the Combine episode, that there was a change in what the track, right? Because the Indianapolis Colts had replaced their turf. And so it was just faster turf to run on, and so all the 40-yard times were kind of screwed up a little bit. Everybody was faster. So he ran a 4.5 on that turf. But on the field, he does look like he's a home run threat. His average yards per reception was 18.8 last year. It was 19.8 in 2020. Those are both really excellent. He finds a way to get into the end zone. The Vikings talked about that specifically, that like, hey, He just gets touchdowns. He does a pretty good job of getting to kind of the apex point of a deep route and figuring out how he needs to stay open from there once he has passed the cornerback, whether that is taking a particular angle or stacking the cornerback or whatever. He does a pretty good job of that. I don't know that he's a good route runner outside of that, but that does kind of help a little bit. He has punt return and kick return experience. He does have other kinds of special team experience. He is, a lot of times considered to be a huge competitor. He does have an injury history. He does have problems with physical corners. I am kind of curious about the difference between the combine numbers and the perception of who he is as a player. But he does have a history of running fast in track environments. So there is that.
For the record, Michigan State did win their one matchup with Michigan this last year.
Oh, who did they lose to? Why didn't they get to the playoff?
Well, they kind of fell apart after that game, sadly. But
that's right. They had the Vikings celebration effect or big game effect, right?
Yeah.
Where they had their game and then, they seemed happy with it. They beat Michigan, right?
Yeah, and honestly, that's where they should have been.
They did
happy.
the thing.
Yeah. They did the thing. Also, Michigan ended up embarrassing themselves later. So really, everybody wins out of that. Let's go to the final pick of the draft, and then we'll circle back to someone else. Round 7, 227 overall. Nick Muse, tight end, South Carolina. This is their tight end.
Hold on, they lost to Purdue? Sorry, that's wild.
Yes, it was. It was very wild at the time.
I remember that now. Oh my God. And then they got blown up by Ohio State. Fine.
Yes.
Okay. Nick Muse, brother of Tanner Muse, who played at Clemson. Very entertaining person, by the way. Check it out his Instagram if you want to see him model. And I don't mean that sarcastically. He is embracing the modeling aspect of Instagram. He's a receiving tight end with a decent amount of athleticism. It was kind of funny. They asked him about it. They're like, "Hey, you transferred from an FCS school. Like, what's your journey like?" And he's like, a lot of stories that get told about football. You've got, this background where, your family is struggling and football is the only thing you have in your life and you need to rise out of the mud. That's not really what happened with me. Except I wasn't recruited. So I guess there's that. It's like what he said. It's like, yeah, I like a grounded dude. Great. He gets it. He understands where he is. But yeah, he's a no-star recruit. He goes to FCS William & Mary. He said something, he didn't like the direction of the program or something like that. And so he transfers to South Carolina. He had a couple of, as anybody who transfers to an SEC school had, a couple of offers at the FBS level from Power 5 schools. But he had some injuries there. He still was a pretty good receiver for the Gamecocks. But he, in the interview that the Vikings had with him, he emphasized that, he loves to block. He much prefers to receive. So I'm glad that he was honest. But, he's fine. He likes blocking. He thinks that blocking is how you earn your receiving reps and stuff like that. I think that he doesn't have the speed that you expect out of the kind of big play threat that he was at South Carolina. I think that that's not something that'll translate in the NFL, but I do think that he has the ability to be an intermediate route runner that has got some upside potentially as a blocker. He's not a very good blocker right now, but he's a very willing blocker, and he's got kind of the physical profile of somebody who can block, 6'4", 260 pounds. That is kind of somebody that if they're a versatile tight end, you can accept that they're a pretty good blocker. I don't know if he'll make the roster, but the Vikings spent their last pick on the weakest probably depth chart on the team. And so there's a very good chance that he makes the roster because he has to beat out a punter for a tight end spot. Godspeed, man.
Well,
Zach Davidson, I'm never going to buy into him.
No. Well, let's get into this. This is why a number of people are listening to the show. Let's get into the discussion on round 2, number 59 overall, Ed Ingram, offensive lineman out of LSU. There are a lot of questions about his off the field issues that we will cover here in just a moment. And we have an anonymous mailbag question that is also worth bringing up. So I'll let you start and we'll get the mailbag question in afterwards.
Sure. So Ed Ingram was accused by two girls under the age of 14. We don't know what age below the age of 14 they are. When he was arrested and accused when he was 19 for an incident that occurred when he was 16. So some people got it a little bit confused about the timeline of events. That's what occurred. He was 16. So in 2015, when he was 16, he, for some time, over a repeated series of events, time and again, allegedly committed acts of sexual assault against two girls under the age of 14 when he was 16. Maybe one of them was 14. I know that those two are related based off of the leaked court documents that were in the Deadspin piece, which we'll link. I want to be very clear that the Deadspin piece is remarkably graphic and it contains very detailed descriptions of what the girls described happened to them. So that's an issue, right? So he was arrested in 2018 for that when he was 19, when the alleged victims came forward. Then, after getting all their statements and being part of the process, the alleged victims did not show up to one of the court hearings or the court hearing. And so Ingram was ruled not guilty. LSU suspended him for the entirety of that season as soon as he was arrested. They reinstated him right before that season. That season, they won a national championship. The issue here is obviously an issue of one of the worst crimes you could be accused of, right? On top of questions of whether or not that should follow you for the rest of your career based off of something that occurred when you were 16, whether or not somebody who is accused of a crime but is not convicted of that crime should be treated as if that crime is a reasonable consideration in their employment, and also whether or not it is meaningfully different for somebody to be employed in the NFL versus in another industry that does not have the social space that the NFL does, right? Because the NFL is a culture producer, right? It is obviously an element of how our culture has created some values, and the NFL emerges as a product of that, and it reinforces those values that it reflects back on what it is built of, right? Of course, like every institution. But the NFL is an institution, and it does have the ability to set standards for what is acceptable and not acceptable, despite being an entertainment product, right? Despite being like, it's silly to think of a football game as having an impact on the attitudes and values that we have in society, but that is just a fact. That is the nature of things, right? Is that our media provides us not only with a reflection of the values that we have imbued into it by being a part of the society that's created the media, but also transmits those values as a mechanism to tell us what is okay and what is not okay. And so the NFL is just a different beast than other elements of industries, right? And so if you say that somebody who has not been convicted of but has been credibly accused of a crime should not have a job, period, you are saying something radically different than they should not have an NFL job, in my opinion. I don't know what that line is, but I know it is wherever that line is well past where the NFL is, right? And I'm sure having a discussion about that line is important. But for now, with regards to Ed Ingram and in regards to the actions the Vikings took to take him, that is a relevant consideration, that the NFL is a different beast than everything else. There are not many industries where reporters get to ask questions about decision makers in those industries on a weekly basis, right? That's how big the industry is and how much of an impact it can have. The most read page in a newspaper is the sports page. Like, it sucks. That shouldn't be the case, but that is the case. It has a big impact on the way that we understand our values in society to be. Okay, So there are two elements here, right? One is, how did he and the Vikings respond, right, to this fact, right, that it's out there that he'd been accused? And two, whether or not he did it. Now, we can't know whether or not he did it, but it is not uncommon for victims to come forward, then discontinue the process. The fact that Ingram was found not guilty is not an indication that the victims lied, right? And if you read the Deadspin piece, you will be subject to a very human emotional bias of seeing some of the worst things that could be described about a person and emotionally responding to it as if it is true. That is just part of being human, is that you read this, you see something specific and graphic, the worst things happened allegedly to these people, and you want justice. And Ed Ingram is that person that you can point to. Despite knowing that that's a bias, I think that there is still a level of credibility to that accusation, especially because a lot of the elements that a lot of people point to in terms of why supposedly somebody would make up these kinds of accusations don't really exist for Ingram here, right? Because he's 16. He's not an athlete who's making money, right? He might be locally popular, but it is not the same as attempting to extort money, an accusation that I think is overblown and happens a lot too often anyway. But also, you can, I'm not going to go over every reason that somebody would choose not to show up in a court hearing. But there's a ton, right? Whether it has to do with being forced to relive the trauma, or being in the same person as somebody, being in the same room as a person that has done something awful to you, or maybe intimidation might play a role, or maybe abuse tactics might play a role. All of these things, can play a role, right? If we assume that Ingram is innocent, right? Not just not guilty, right? He's factually within the legal context not guilty, right? If we assume that Ingram's innocent, it still isn't appropriate the way the Vikings or Ingram handled the line of questioning that they received, because it is an important issue, and they could have used this opportunity to elucidate either what the Vikings, why they thought it was appropriate to employ a player, very high profile position, right? A person potentially earning millions of dollars a year in the NFL on national TV every week. Why they thought it was appropriate, if he's innocent, why they thought he might have been innocent, right? Or at least not guilty. And Ingram could have used this opportunity to make a stand or a statement about the importance of these allegations, defend himself, right? And say, the stance is that, I didn't do this, but I don't want to take away from how important these issues are, without detracting from the moment. Now, there was a bunch of questions that I got on Twitter, a bunch of pushback too, that I got on Twitter from people who, let me see if I can find real quickly, Seifert ESPN, because I think Kevin was the one who, when Ingram hopped on to, it wasn't a Zoom call, it was a Microsoft Teams call, hopped onto the conference call, Kevin Seifert asked, was it difficult, to go through the whole thing with all the stuff in your background? And he answered that, just try to look past you, try to focus on football and stuff like that. And then Seifert asked him directly, the allegations that have been described, did those events occur? Very directly, did you do it? Did you do any of those things? Right? And he said, right now, I just want to focus on what's going on right now. We just got drafted, a lot of friends and family congratulating me. It's just about a happy moment right now for my life. Now, if he is not guilty of what he's been accused of, if he's innocent, actually, of what he's been accused of, this is an awful situation for him to have to deal with, right? That is unfortunately the nature of things, right? Reporters are always going to, especially in the NFL, reporters are always going to ask you about your worst moments at your best moments, right? That's going to happen, right? And you need to do a better job of acknowledging how serious this stuff is before you can move forward, because you can have a happy moment with your family, right? Instead of just saying, hey, come on, I just got drafted. Let's not talk about all this downer buzzkill stuff, right? And then we got pushback for asking this. Like, hey, terrible question to ask, right? Like, why would you ask that? And like, first, ethically, you have to allow somebody who's accused of this sort of thing to respect, because we have to write about it. There's no question that we have to write about it. Why did he fall in the draft? What is the biggest red flag in his background? Why would the Vikings be concerned? What are the potential pitfalls of the pick? Just from a mechanistic standpoint, even independent of the moral considerations, we have to talk about it. So ethically, we have to give him a chance to respond. We're not going to talk about it without giving him a chance to respond. And so, yeah, it might occur at like this wonderful moment for him, but if we don't respond, it is worse for him. Like, you have to let him address what's going on and refuse to address it, right? And so that's an issue. Now, when we talked to the Vikings about it, we asked, hey, what about this process, made you comfortable with this pick? And they did not say anything along the lines of, he didn't do it, which I understand is they can't really say they could get into a lot of trouble saying something like that. Like, I understand why they wouldn't say that outright, because it exposes them to, I think, probably civil litigation potentially, and it certainly exposes them to looking much worse if more evidence comes out later, right? I understand why they wouldn't say we don't think he did it, right? I understand that. They said that we're comfortable with the person that he is. So we asked about the nature of the investigation. Did you talk to the victims, right? And they wouldn't answer that. And the thing is here, the reason that you asked that question is because it has become so common for NFL teams to, and we just saw this with Deshaun Watson, it has become so common for NFL teams to conduct a self-serving investigation and talk to the people that have a motivation to tell you what you want to hear that'll allow you to get what you want done. So, for example, I believe the Miami Dolphins talked to the victims' lawyers. I don't know that for sure. But the Browns did not. The Browns did not talk to the victims' lawyers. They did not talk to the victims. They talked to Deshaun Watson's legal team, and the Browns noted, hey, 2 of those members of the legal team are women. Now, that's disgusting, first of all, to say that. But second, they're like financially and in some element of professional obligation, ethically obligated to make Deshaun Watson look as good as possible. They would be fired if they didn't say that they were comfortable with Deshaun Watson, right? Like, they would be fired by the law firm that employs them, as well as by Deshaun Watson as lawyers. Like, they have a motivated reason for saying what they said in a way that doesn't even implicate them as people, right? Because they're under a lot of pressure, right? And so that's why we have to ask, like, did you get more than one side to this story? Like, yeah, his teammates like him, but you hear every day about people who commit these awful acts and other people being like, well, he was great to me, and I was totally surprised. He was so quiet, right? Like, it doesn't matter that his teammates liked him, that he was mature in the way that he handled his business off the field since then, right? That doesn't matter that his coaches thought he was coachable, right? It matters whether or not he did it, and whether or not there was a lesson learned or a moment or something he thought about the importance of something, about his interaction or his relationship to women or something, right? Like, it is entirely possible that he did something that was consensual, and afterwards they were uncomfortable and they said that the consent was withdrawn when that was not communicated to him. Maybe that's possible. I'm not going to give him that benefit of the doubt. But the Vikings did not elucidate whether or not they talked to the victims. And again, I understand why they wouldn't say whether or not they did, because even if they did talk to the victims or the victims' lawyers, or the prosecution or something along those lines, even if they did talk to somebody that has a reason to believe the alleged victim's story, if they said that they had talked to the victims and then drafted the guy, they would, by implication, potentially be saying, we think that they're lying, or we think that that doesn't matter. And so they wouldn't say whether or not they talked to the victims. I understand that that is their structural problem here. And own it. Just own that. That's how you resolve the ethical obligation. Own it, right? Like, if hey, did you talk to the victims or did you talk to the victims' lawyers, right? Yes, we did. Right now, obviously, you say yes, we did, and now you're like, hey, did you think that they were lying? Right, is the next question, and you're in a really tough spot. But guess what? You created that tough spot by drafting this player. So that's like your next most ethical steps are to do stuff that makes you look bad because you did the bad thing, right? And so from there on, you have to address those questions. And they chose not to do that. I think they chose the coward's way out. Really disappointed in the Vikings from that perspective. Now, Ed Ingram, the player, I don't think is very good at football. He strikes me as more of a third-round pick than a second-round pick from a talent perspective. And he was already being pushed down boards because of all of these off-field concerns and the allegations from multiple minors about felony assault. The fact that he got drafted beyond those concerns suggests that the Vikings did not even discount his value based on, he's a second-round pick, right? They did not even discount his value based on the potential risk of an off-field concern. And so it would suggest it's not even an element, right? And I wouldn't say he's uncuttable, right, as a second-round pick, but it is extremely rare for a second-round pick to be cut as a rookie. Extremely rare. And so they have essentially committed, with the amount of value that they've invested in Ingram, to having him on the roster for an entire season. And I don't even think that he's that good of a player. Now, in terms of his pass protection, it's fine. I think that he can get got by quicker players. But I think that he's not necessarily a great fit for zone in terms of his speed. Even Kwesi, when he was discussing his football playing ability, mentioned that their offensive line coach, I forget his name now, would call, linemen with really quick feet dancing bears. Fred Astaire's, that's it. And he did not tag Ingram with the Fred Astaire tag. I don't know why Kwesi told us this. He was just a threshold below it, I think is what Kwesi said. He's a second round pick. That's like weird to me to do that. So I don't think that the pick was remarkable. I think that it's a second round pick. He's now the favorite to start at right guard for the Vikings with Ezra Cleveland at left guard. We'll see how that goes.
Before we get to the question, I would like to compliment Luke Braun. We have a wonderful little running bit on our podcast about Luke Braun being a terrible person and it may have been a serial killer and all that, or just not being very good at his job. I do want to compliment him on his summary of the charges and his explanation of it from Saturday afternoon, or Saturday evening rather, from that episode that he had put out. It's definitely worth checking out. Luke did an excellent job. Here's the question.
I would, by the way, I want to add, I agree with that.
Yeah. Here's the question that we got in that was asked to be anonymous. This is a long-time listener. We've actually met this listener before. Long-time listener of the show. Asks, this question is for Arif regarding Ed Ingram. Kwesi came to football, a male-dominated industry riddled with sexual misconduct, from finance, a male-dominated industry riddled with sexual misconduct. After drafting Ingram, I was dismayed, both as a fan and as a therapist who works with victims of sexual assault. I appreciated hearing about how you, Arif, and Kevin Seifert pushed Kwesi to address this issue, but couldn't help but wonder, does the absence of women in football, coaches, administration, press, etc., make it easier for teams to ignore the severity of the issue? Would Kwesi be less evasive and more concerned if a female journalist pressed him? Would he answer differently to fans who are sexual assault victims themselves? I'm having a hard time reconciling my fandom of this team after such a lackadaisical response to this accusation.
So one of the questions I asked was, the Vikings have had a history of some high-profile players recently who have had allegations of violence against women. There's a reference to both Dalvin Cook and Jeff Gladney. Are you concerned about the signal this sends with another player being added to the roster that has a history of those kinds of allegations? Here's what he said. Again, those are serious allegations. We did extensive research with people in and around the situation, in and around the program, in and around him. We're extremely comfortable with the person, but I understand the question why you asked it. Now, that does not answer my question. My question was not, do you think that he is a good guy? My question is, are you concerned about the signal this sends? And that is one of the more disappointing ways to handle that question. Because you need to make sure, like, your responsibility as somebody who's running a literal $1 billion organization, right? Like, you are head boss, you hire and fire, right? You are selecting the employees that work for you, right? And you have one of the most public organizations that exists out there with that valuation, along with the 31 other NFL teams, right? You send an enormous signal. I already talked about that. Does that signal or does that interact with the fact that football is male dominated? Yes, absolutely. I think that for example, when you take a look at players of the history of domestic violence accusations or sexual assault allegations in the draft, and you take a look at some of the stuff that you see from, like Bob McGinn or in the past Nolan Iraqi, they would quote scouts, right, about essentially what they think about this player, right? And most of their responses are they dogpile a player if they think the player is not coachable, if they think that the player is dumb, just like dumb, like makes dumb decisions generally, but they don't really dogpile a player for like sexual misconduct, right, or DV all that often, right? Like you'll see some quotes from scouts, right? That has to do with probably two things: one, the number of men in the industry, but two, also the pressures that exist within the industry to win at all costs. And I think that's actually a little bit more important because I was just talking about the Deshaun Watson thing. The Browns talked to two women lawyers. Those lawyers have a series of pressures pushing down on them to respond in particular ways, right? And so just having women in positions of power, that's good. That's not enough, right? Because if they are structurally pressured to prioritize wins above all else, they'll do some of the same things. Like that's like one of the issues with tokenism versus representation in media, right? That's a discussion that people have about whether or not a character exists in a show for the show to say, hey, we've got a black character, hey, we've got a trans character, hey, we've got a disabled character, or the show gets to represent their perspective in a way that interacts with the story, that exposes audiences to what it means to live with a different perspective and a different background, right? Those are very different things. Similarly, having women in positions of power or having women throughout the building will be helpful because their experiences will inform the way that you make a lot of these decisions if you consult them and bring them into the process. But if their job is dependent on them saying you're making the right decision, there's going to be a limit to how helpful that is. So my answer to that is yes and no. In these questions, would Kwesi be less evasive, more concerned if a female journalist pressed him? Would he answer differently to fans who are sexual assault victims themselves? I think probably he would answer differently in those circumstances, which is itself a problem because we cannot, as I'm a male reporter who does not have a history of sexual assault in my background personally. And I cannot offload that burden to women and sexual assault victims to ask those questions and be the ones who ask those questions to get the answers that we need from organizations when they make these kinds of decisions. And that sucks that they might get a more meaningful or more informed response from people in power because they're scared or whatever to look into the eyes of somebody who has experienced that or lives under the threat of that in a more concrete fashion than I would, right? And it is disgusting that we would have to use this trauma and expose it and re-traumatize somebody potentially in order to get that question and answer out there. Like, it is extremely broken that for some of the most important issues in society that we have, the most impassioned people, the most effective activists on those issues, or most effective journalists, or most effective administrators, and most effective politicians on those issues are people who have to relive their trauma in order to get those issues addressed. That is broken. But I think ultimately, and I'm sorry, the answer probably is yes, that we would have gotten maybe a different answer. So that is my reaction, I think, to this question. I think I'm glad you asked it. I remain concerned about the way that the Vikings have talked about this.
There's one other question that we can just quick handle here with this. A fellow by the name of Denver asks, what can you tell about the culture of the new regime given the drafting of Ingram? Typically, Rick seemed to avoid players with off-the-field issues, to my understanding.
I don't know that Rick, and I guess you didn't see it as often, so I get it. Right? Because I wouldn't say that, for example, Spielman, that there's something that I'm aware of, right? Where Spielman should have been aware of what was going to happen with Jeff Gladney or Dalvin Cook, right? Like, that was not, as far as I can recall, in their history. There was some off-field stuff regarding Dalvin Cook, unrelated to, as far as I can remember, violence against women, and more related to incidents in high school involving animals, which there's a lot of very weird reporting about there that I don't really think was very fair to Dalvin Cook. But maybe I don't. So here's the problem: is that the culture of a football team is not very much tied to the likelihood that the players will commit some level of offense outside of a football field. It is very much tied into work ethic and motivation and practice habits and stuff like that. And so. And I guess this is the question about the culture of the new regime, but like these things tend to very often be separate, right? Now, in terms of the culture of the new regime, this is kind of like relevant. What's interesting is that after the Ingram pick, you have a bunch of people who have like these stellar off-field, maybe resumes is the wrong word, but like reputations, right? Like a couple of these guys are known extremely well for working hard. Caleb Evans started the Caleb Evans Foundation, and community and civic service is like very important to his identity. Ty Chandler is really well lauded by coaches in terms of his coachability and the way that he interacts. Vidarian Lowe, has kids and is a mature family man with high character. Jalen Naylor is well liked by his coaches. They talked about him a little bit. Nick Muse is remarkably well liked. He's got all kinds of and so it's kind of interesting that they grabbed a bunch of people after the Ingram pick that were like, yeah, these are really like stellar humans. Like one of them started a foundation. These other guys did all this charitable work. These guys are all very coachable and mature. They'll bring an anchor to the locker room, which is like great, but it feels like hopefully that wasn't like a response, right? Because as much as a lot of people think of ethics as a balancing system, it's not really a scale where you weigh all the bad things against all the good things you did. It's just not how it works. So, yeah, I think that, unfortunately, this is just one off season. And so I think we'll have to wait because this is not unusual for football teams. It is not, right? The Kansas City Chiefs drafted Tyreek Hill in the 5th round, right, from West Alabama. It's just it's not, right? I think Dorial Green-Beckham was something similar. The Eagles drafted him, I want to say, in the 2nd round. He didn't even play, the year before he got drafted. Um, and honestly, the Eagles, from a front office perspective, are generally a much better organization from a lot of these perspectives. And these things have. So I don't think it's unique to the Vikings, but as we continue forward, we'll see what the Vikings kind of do about it. We'll see if the Vikings continue to, make these kind of decisions that are worth, serious investigation and introspection.
Well, let's do some. This episode's gone a little longer than we had expected. We're actually going to be putting this into a part 2. We're breaking out a Dusty era tradition, unlike any other. We're going to do a part 2 for the mailbag. So let's just wrap up with a little bit of undrafted free agent stuff. What can you tell us about the undrafted free agents?
Yeah, so the Vikings. I don't know about half of these undrafted free agents. I'm not very familiar at the moment. I'll do some more research on players like Mike Brown, Zach McLeod, and I know a tiny bit about Josh Sokol, but not enough about Josh Sokol that I'd feel like super comfortable talking about him. Thomas Hennigan, a wide receiver from Appalachian State. My understanding of him, based off of what very little I've been able to find out about him, I haven't even watched him yet, but based off of what other scouting reports exist on him, is that I think he ran a 4.740. It's very slow, but he is kind of I wouldn't say a bigger receiver, but he's supposed to play pretty big. Kind of a jump ball guy. His explosion scores were not remarkable to that effect, so I wouldn't say that is kind of a saving grace in terms of his speed. And he is supposed to be a somewhat good route runner. So I guess keep that in mind. I wouldn't really peg him to be somebody who makes the roster, especially after the Vikings added another receiver via the draft in Jalen Nailor. So there's that. Josh Sokol, Sacred Heart, was one of the best centers at his level of football, which Sacred Heart is in the Northeast. I want to say it's a Division II school. And I believe he won some awards. I think he won some all-conference awards for it. Pretty decent in terms of athletic capability. His 40 time isn't great, but his short shuttle, which translates a lot more at center than any other workout, his short shuttle was pretty good, especially for an undrafted free agent. Like, you take a look at all these undrafted free agent centers, I think he might have the fastest short shuttle out of all of those guys. So it's not quite like Cam Jurgens or anything like that, but it is pretty good. And so that athleticism showed up on the field for him at Sacred Heart. And he played with a little bit of attitude and meanness, which is nice to see from a guy that you typically expect, as a zone center is not always going to have it. But he's a little bit bigger at 309 pounds. So he might have a little bit of power to deal with, players that typically would do a lot of damage. Tyree Stevenson, defensive tackle from Tulsa, enormous dude. If I recall, he was like 352 pounds. Obviously he's a nose tackle, right? For a nose tackle, he showcased a little bit of athletic capability. I'd say it's more burst than it was agility, based off of what I saw in Tulsa. His agility scores reflect that. They're pretty bad. His explosion scores aren't like great or anything like that. But for a 352 pound person, they're not bad. And if he drops to 330, I would expect that his explosion scores are in line with some of the somewhat more explosive nose tackles across the NFL. Not remarkably productive, but he was very difficult to move, and he showcased some decent hands from what I saw of him. So he'll be kind of interesting. The Vikings do not have a ton of nose tackle depth, but that's fake because they can always move Harrison Phillips to nose tackle, so they've got some shadow depth there. That's nice. Luigi Villan, what can you say? Phenomenal name.
We're taking the Case Cookus route on this fellow.
Yeah. I hope it's pronounced Luigi. I'd be devastated to find out that it's not. But yeah, he's an edge rusher from Wake Forest. He, I don't think he was given a draftable grade by Dan Brugler, but he was given a priority free agent grade, and he gave him like a little bit of a scouting report. He is an older player, which is unfortunate, but he does kind of fit the mold of an edge rusher, right? So he's 255 pounds, which is the exact same weight that Daniel Hunter was coming out. So in terms of modern edge rushers, that's the exact weight you're looking for. He's got a pretty good wingspan, much the same way, 79 and 1/8 inches. But the thing that stands out to me, were first his remarkable 10-yard split, but second his great agility scores, especially the 7.01 second three cone. That translates really, really, really well at the edge rusher position, especially at 255 pounds. He's slightly shorter for an edge rusher at 6'3", but I think that generally his size kind of makes up for it. And it shows up on the field. He had a little bit of burst while he was getting across the line of scrimmage. He demonstrated bend, which is kind of rare in this year's draft class. And he led the team in sacks, right? Like he was productive at Wake Forest. But again, he was older than everybody else. So that's something you got to keep in mind. But he has length, he's got speed, he's got burst, and he's got agility. So there's something there. That he needs some more technical development, and as an older player, again, that's not something that you can get a lot out of. And then the punter, Ryan Wright from Tulane, first of all, he's one of those punters that like ran a 40-yard dash. He's like decided that was like, he wanted to do that, which, great, good for you. I want to say, and I'm double checking this right now, I want to say he ran a 4.6, which for a punter is like crazy fast, right? Like that's, yeah.
At that point, he's just showing off.
Yeah. Okay, so he was timed at a pro day at 4.6, but his entry in the Blesto database is 4.74 seconds. So a little bit different, still quite fast, faster than a lot of quarterbacks in the modern NFL at 240 pounds. So good for him. He had I believe he led the NCAA for 2 consecutive years, I want to say, in gross punting average. And he also had a fairly decent, and I'm double checking that right now using the PFF database, which is always really nice to use as a cheat, because I think he was the 6th graded punter on PFF. Yeah, he was. He also had a pretty decent yards per return and return rate. He only had 6 of his punts out of 51 returned. That's a return rate of 11.8%. That is the lowest return rate of any punter graded in the top 25 from PFF. And it's the lowest return rate. Let me see if I can sort it by. It's the 2nd lowest return rate of punters at all. The only lower return rate was a punter from Coastal Carolina that averaged 10 yards fewer a punt. The only reason that the return rate was so low for him is because it was so easy for gunners to get to the guy because the ball wasn't going very far. So that's something to keep in mind. His hang time, his average hang time is kind of up there along with some of the better punters. 4.13 seconds. It's a pretty good hang time. And that's one reason that Ryan Wright's return rate was so low, 11.8%, second lowest in the NCAA. So really high gross, really high net after you include returns. 3rd highest in the NCAA, highest gross in the NCAA. And a pretty good rate of inside the 20 to touchback. Still has some control work to do. So I actually would not be surprised if he beat out Jordan Berry for the punt return job. The thing is, Jordan Berry is a very good holder. And so Ryan Wright has to learn that. And, if he does have that, if he has that down, that'll be great because you can run some interesting like fake punts with a guy that has that kind of reasonable athleticism. So yeah, I like him.
That's
it. That's all the undrafted. Oh, and also they signed Jake Vargas, but he's not an undrafted free agent. He was on the team last year.
Yeah. Well, that's going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. You'll get the part 2 of this episode here on Wednesday night, Thursday morning. So this will be mainly mailbag. So check that out here. Arif, where can they find your work?
Yeah, you can find my work at The Athletic, theathletic.com/author/Arif-Hassan. I've got a bunch of stuff grading, the Vikings. I've graded the entire draft using the consensus big board. We've got pieces from Chad and I on everybody picked on day 1 and day 2, just really quick reactions. And I'm going to be doing breakdowns and scouting reports on the players that the Vikings drafted for the first 2 days in the coming weeks.
Well, again, that's going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. Check out part 2 later this week. For Arif, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening. And please remember, the Vikings are not to be trusted. And we'll be back Wednesday night, Thursday morning. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, and wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan of The Athletic, and he can be found at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN or my personal account at Big Mono. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can do so in a few different ways. You can go to patreon.com/NorseCode and donate there. For $3.50 a month, you get bonus material and more. You can also go to paypal.me/NorseCode for a one-time donation, or you can go to norsecode.threadless.com and pick up some Norse Code merchandise. Any questions or comments that cannot fit in a tweet can be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this.
All things are possible through the power of Ben DiNucci.